I'm Chris Carter of the Locked On Steelers podcast. Today, we'll talk about why I still think there are some big moves coming from this front office, that a new quarterback being a pre-draft visit, and more here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things in the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making us your first listen every day because we're your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel Sportsbook is the number one sportsbook in America. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 back in bonus bets by winning any $5 bet or more. That's $200 back. If your bet wins, visit FanDuel.com/locked-on to get started. Let us get started here, Steelers fans. So I want to take a step back. We've been doing a lot of hard looks at draft picks and things like that and moves that they've made. And let's look at the Steelers front office and what's been they say an unprecedented offseason so far, and it's only late March. We still have a whole month of what the Steelers still could do in free agency, still do in trades, and then there's the whole draft that could happen after that. There's a lot of stuff that could still happen, but I do think that there are still big moves coming from this front office. I can't say what they're going to be. I'm not, and this isn't me sourcing anything. This is me saying, hey, just when I read tea leaves, when I'm reading the Steelers, and that's where most of my takes come from. Understand, when I'm coming at you with this stuff, this is just based off of how I study the team and what they've been. And part of what I have begun to acknowledge, I've been acknowledging more and more, this front office throws a lot of precedent out the window. And when I say a lot of precedent, I mean things that we used to track. They used to be like, oh, the Steelers would never make a move like that. Now they do. Like, you might remember the clip that we played from the Combine where Mark Caboli of The Athletic asked Omar at the Combine, like, oh, so what do you think about Russell Wilson coming to the Steelers? Is that going to happen? And that's not to throw any shade on Mark, but like at the time, most of the people that covered the Steelers thought that was a joke because it always was a joke, because every year there was always, for years, even before they actually did sign Patrick Peterson, for years when Patrick Peterson was in the middle of his Hall of Fame career and he was in his prime, every year there was the Steelers signed Patrick Peterson, and that kind of stuff never happened. And the Steelers, whenever they made a big splash in free agency, it was a reasonable free agent like a James Ferry or a Jeff Hardings or a Ryan Clark, guys that became, important pieces, but, were also like not, top of the line free agents that everyone was talking about, going into things. And not that Russell Wilson is top of the line right now, but you get my point. Like still a quarterback, the quarterback upheaval we've seen. We've never seen something like this with the Steelers, where a first round draft pick quarterback is shipped out while they bring in a former Super Bowl champion quarterback and a guy who was another first round pick who has the kind of pedigree of Justin Fields. And so there's a lot of unprecedented things that are happening there. And make no mistake, there are certain precedents that still matter. And we talked about this with like Alan Saunders on yesterday's episode, when we talked about it with him and saying like, hey, like the Steelers probably are still going to, use the method of how they scout and reach out and form their big board. And that means, guys that get pro day visits from Mike Tomlin and Omar and get heavily looked at, whether they're at the, get a combine visit and a pro day visit and a top 30 invite. Those are the people that we're circling with a big red marker saying this is probably a first round target they're looking at here. Those type of things won't go away, but the expectations that we used to have for what the Steelers wouldn't do to make their roster complete, I do think need to be put aside for a little bit, especially because of the times that we're in. And I've talked about this a little bit before, but I want to harp on it again here, because Omar is very much where Kevin Colbert was in the early 2000s. And if you think back to the early 2000s, that's where the Steelers started to make a lot of aggressive moves. You think back to, making signings like James Ferrier, moving guys around, trying to find the right guy. I mean, you think back to when Cordell Stewart was the guy, and they brought in a guy like Tommy Maddox from the XFL, and then eventually drafted Ben Roethlisberger. But even outside of that, trading up to get a Troy Polamalu, making aggressive moves, kind of being able to make more shifts that later on over the next 20 years after. I mean, again, Ben Roethlisberger was drafted in 2004, and even after that, they still were pretty aggressive in certain regards. There were trades involved in the San Antonio Holmes draft year, but the Steelers didn't get as aggressive in many of the years in the 2010s, and not because they didn't care to, but because they had a foundation, and they're like, look, we got our franchise quarterback. There's certain limits that happen when you get your guy and you're trying to build around them, and you're also having other pillar players. And that's another part of it. It's like the Steelers, I know some people look at their recent draft history and say, oh, well, they're just terrible at picking first round draft pick. No, they're not. Historically, no. They like certainly you could cherry pick and pick certain ones that are bad, but for everyone you could cherry pick bad, there's more than you could cherry pick that are very good and that are pillar players that they're paying right now. Cam Hayward is taking up contract money because he's a great first round draft pick. TJ Watt's taking up great contract money because he's a great first round draft pick. If Ryan Shazier didn't get paralyzed, he'd be taking up money right now because he'd be a great first round draft pick. If David DeCastro and Marquise Pouncey didn't retire early, they probably would be retired like by this year. But over in the past 2 to 3 years, where the Steelers could have really used an all-pro center and an all-pro guard, or at least guys who used to be all pros and could uphold the standards of the offense, those were all because their early picks were hits in a lot of regards. And now they're in a situation where, hey, you know what? They have missed on some early picks. You look and again, like, this is acknowledging that, like, Kevin Colbert, the end of his run of first round picks was not great. Terrell Edmonds, was a good player, but not a first round pick type of guy. Devin Bush started out looking like a great first round pick, and then he, after his injury, never was the same guy. 2020, they didn't have one because they traded for Minka Fitzpatrick. 2021, Najee Harris. No, excuse me, not Najee Harris. No, yeah. 2021. You get my point. Sorry, it's late as I'm filling this. I've had some technical difficulties today. But point being, like, you go throughout the years, like, there's a lot of first round draft picks that aren't on the team anymore that are recent. And when you do that, that opens up more things that the Steelers have to answer there. And I think that's where the Steelers are kind of at, and why they have a little bit more liberty there. It was Najee Harris in 2021. I was bugging. But point being, like, Najee Harris, you look back, of the past before Broderick Jones, of the past 4 first round picks, he's the only one that's still on the team. And that's a problem. And that's what the Steelers are at right now, and they're trying to fix that. But that's why Omar Khan and Andy Weidel, they can be more aggressive right now, because there's certain guys they don't have to pay as much money to stick around. And I think that's where the Steelers are this year. So when we're thinking of, the Steelers, they've already been aggressive, man. They signed Patrick Queen. They traded Deontay Johnson. They got Dante Jackson in. They got Russell Wilson and Justin Fields. What more do you want this offseason? And it's not a what more do you want. It's an acknowledgement like, hey, this roster still has a lot of work to do to be a complete roster. They still need a center. They still need, I think they still need an offensive tackle. I think they definitely still need a slot cornerback. I think they definitely need another number 2 wide receiver, or just a wide receiver to pair with George Pickens, whether he would be a 1 or a 2 with Pickens, whatever they do there. I think they would behoove them to get a receiver like that and a legitimate 3, because I'm not sure that Cordero Patterson qualifies as a legitimate 3. But point being, there's a lot of work for the Steelers to do right now. And I think that the Steelers front office, they acknowledge that. And that's why they've been aggressive in the first place leading up to this point. But what I'm telling you is, don't sleep on the idea that they're not going to make big moves. Now, I'm not saying a big move is going to happen today or tomorrow. And I'm not saying source this is happening, but I'm saying, if you look at the way that they're operating right now, I would expect the Steelers to be very active on draft day, and what they're doing right now is they're probably studying the heck out of the board, not just for their own needs, but for what other people need. And teams that get to a point where, say, like how the Steelers need a center, maybe there's teams out there that need a tight end really bad, or a safety really bad, or a linebacker, or just some other position. And if the guys that are of the caliber of that round that they're in, say the first, second, or even the third round, and that they notice, like, hey, according to our board, all the targets that they need at that position aren't there anymore, they might want to trade out of that pick. What can we do to get that pick, and who can we get with it that would help us? I think the Steelers are going to be very active in the trade market on draft day, even if it only results in one or two, even two trades. They could get two trades, but even if it results in just one trade, I still think there's a big move coming from this front office, because there's still too important of needs. And we hear how excited Mike Tomlin is about this season. Troy Polamalu has even gone on the record to say this has been an unprecedented offseason. I just look at all that, and things add up to me. The Steelers have something else up cooking. It's just about waiting on other teams, seeing what the best time to strike, and then making the move there. We'll see what Omar Khan and Andy Weidel and Mike Tomlin have in store there. But we got to talk about another move they're planning to make. They got to look at their draft prospects, and one draft prospect they're bringing in is Michael Penix, the quarterback out of Washington. I want to talk about that visit means and what it could mean for the Steelers' draft plans, and if they will add a drafting quarterback into this quarterback room that they've already assembled in one off season. That and a lot more here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. But first, I want to remind you this show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America. Say goodbye to busted brackets, because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tournament. Whether you're betting on a big upset or on a 1 seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, you can download FanDuel right to your phone, and new customers will get $200 back in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. That's right, $200 if your first bet of $5 or more wins, and that $200 can be used on anything from point spreads to money lines, or even you picking who's going to win it all. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon for new customers to get $200 back in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. And that's on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue this episode, and we switch it to talking about the draft a little bit and what the Steelers are looking at. So we do now know the Steelers are planning a visit with Michael Penix Jr., the quarterback out of Washington. And he said so as much after Washington's pro day this week, saying that he has one plan for the Steelers. And that's an interesting tidbit, because we were talking about the Steelers' top 30 visits, and tracking those with Alan Saunders from SteelersNow.com. Just yesterday's episode. So go check that out if you missed it, because we went over a lot in that episode. But I do think it's interesting to see that Michael Penix is coming in for a visit, and it opens up some interesting discussion that can happen about, would the Steelers take a quarterback in this draft class? And I do think so. And I've talked about the potential of that happening on this show, but let's look at Michael Penix, for example. Now, Michael Penix is a guy that, personally, I've liked Michael Penix since he was at Indiana. I remember when he beat Penn State that one time, hey, that guy has moxie, that guy has guts. And I think that there's a lot to his game that the Steelers could like. Now, here's the thing about Michael Penix is that he's about to be 24 years old, just like Kenny Pickett was when he was coming out the draft. He's 6'3", just like Kenny Pickett is. I think he has a higher ceiling with the tools that he has. I think his arm's a bit stronger, and I think he can be a little bit more accurate, and he's more mobile. But all that to say, Michael Penix, has those things on his side, but he's also been more injury prone. You look at how many season-ending injuries he's had in his time, at Indiana and Washington, and that's something that teams are going to look at and be like, I don't know. And that's why I don't think he's going to be a first-round pick. And if you look at this quarterback class, he's in that second tier, and probably in the lower part of that second tier of quarterbacks in this draft class. And when I say that second tier, I mean there's that obvious first tier that's going probably in the top 5 picks. Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Drake May. Those guys, count them out. Steelers don't have a chance at those guys. They're gonna get drafted up way high. And then there's that second trio of quarterbacks. You got J.J. McCarthy of Michigan, Bo Nix of Oregon, and Michael Penix Jr., of course, of Washington. Now, there's some that are saying J.J. McCarthy is going to go top 10 as well, and that'd be a thing if it does happen. Good for the Steelers. I don't think that I just haven't seen enough of him to know whether or not he's going to be a good NFL quarterback, just based off the way Michigan played offense. Bo Nix is another guy that I think compares a lot to Kenny Pickett, and just the profile that he would bring. And I'm like, okay, but there's some people that project him to go in the top 15. If the Steelers saw 5 quarterbacks go in the top 15 picks, great, because you know what? That means there's only 15 picks that between them and getting one of the players that they really like. And I'm pretty sure about maybe 5 of those 15 are going to go at wide receivers. So now you're talking about offensive tackle and corner. Hello, there's a lot of options there. Maybe center could still be in play there as well. Point being, let's get back to Michael Penix. Penix, though, is not a guy that I don't think anyone is projected to go in the first round. And if they have, maybe I missed it. But I look at Penix and I think that everyone kind of agrees, like, he's more of a second round guy, maybe even the third round guy, based off of his injury history and just where things are. And I think what the Steelers are doing for bringing him in for a visit, they look at him and there's comparisons made to Russell Wilson. There's comparisons made to, there's things to say that he, what he can do in the NFL. And I think like the Steelers, like, you look at his tape, there's things to love about Michael Penix. He throws a very pretty ball. He can be very accurate. He can read the field. He's a captain. He's a leader. He goes for it. His guys get behind him. That's all the stuff the Steelers wanted to get out of Kenny Pickett. And I think it makes sense there. Now, the question is, would it make sense to get him where a lot of people have him valued in the draft process? And a lot of draft experts are saying, like, it's probably going to take a second round pick to get him. I don't think the Steelers are doing that to get Michael Penix. I think that they're going to whatever the first round pick is, if it's a center, guess what? The second round pick is probably going to be a wide receiver or an offensive tackle. If the first round pick is an offensive tackle, wide receiver, the second round pick is probably going to be a center, or defensive tackle or something like that. But throwing a quarterback into the mix of those early picks then would even further jeopardize the Steelers' chances to actually complete this roster. And again, a Michael Penix, if he's brought into the current Steelers quarterback situation with Russell Wilson and Justin Fields, he's not starting this year. So you'd be looking at, if you think Michael Penix is the guy, great. But, I think that you'd be looking at it, you'd be missing out on an opportunity to work with the 2 quarterbacks that you just invested in to get a guy that you're not going to use for quite some time. And I think the Steelers can't afford to do that because, like we just talked about, Mike Tomlin saying, he's very excited, or Ryan Clark rather was saying this is the most exciting Mike Tomlin's been for a Steelers team coming out of the offseason. And I look at this and I think that, like, man, like, it wouldn't make sense to take Penix there. Now, the Steelers could be doing their due diligence. We know that they do this all the time. They talk to players who they know they're not going to get. Heck, they talked to Justin Fields. Like there's that video of when Mike Tomlin went to Ohio State's pro day and he made sure to kind of muck it up with Fields a little bit. And now Fields is a Pittsburgh Steeler. And we've seen it before with guys like Minkah Fitzpatrick, who the Steelers knew they weren't going to get in the draft. But who knows? Maybe someday it'll come back around. And then when he was ready to get traded, he was like, I like Mike Tomlin. I'll go there. Those type of things are maybe happening with Michael Penix here, is that maybe he doesn't get drafted by the Steelers, but someday he winds up on the roster, and this would be their chance to establish that relationship with him. But even if it doesn't, maybe it's also them acknowledging, like, hey, maybe he falls down the board a lot, because if you miss the boat on those early quarterbacks, maybe you don't want to take him in the second round, and maybe he falls to the third round, or even crazy enough like the fourth, because of his injury history. And then the Steelers are like, all right, now we'll take him because we've addressed a lot of our other big needs there. And I think that's a possibility there, but I still think the more likely option, if the Steelers are to address the quarterback position in the draft, is going probably in the fourth round and getting one of those other guys that's in that, like, I guess the third tier after that, and maybe even the fourth tier technically. But like after Penix, I think everyone would agree there's a big drop off. There's guys like Michael Pratt of Tulane. There's Spencer Rattler of South Carolina. Jordan Travis, who's been nursing the injury that ended his season from Florida State. But the guy I think would be a very interesting, just, hey, let's take a flyer on him in like the fourth or the fifth rounds or whatever, is Joe Milton out of Tennessee. The guy is a cannon. The guy's huge, 6'5", 230, and he can move. I've seen him play live. He would take a lot of coaching up. Like he wouldn't be ready to be the guy coming into the NFL. But that could be a great situation when you have Russell Wilson and Justin Fields to buy you time to maybe, hey, Joe, you're going to spend at least 2 years learning behind veterans. Do that, and then if you take the step up, maybe you can get your shot to be the guy. But all of those moves make a little bit more sense than Michael Penix in the second, simply because, again, the Steelers they have so many needs to fill right now, and you need those early picks to be able to do that. I just think that it makes a lot more sense what the Steelers are doing. If they're going to get a quarterback, if they're going to get Penix and he falls to the second, third round pick that they have, and they feel like they've hit on the other three on positions that they really need to fill out, or if they just need to, if he just falls further than that, like, and there's an option there, maybe then they take Michael Penix. But I don't see them doing that in the second round or anything like that, because the Steelers have too many other needs to complete this roster, as far as what they've got to do. But we got to take another quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about what I think is dividing the Steelers fans right now, and it's something that caught me a bit off guard with how serious it's gotten. We'll talk about that more here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue our show here. Now, let's get into this. This is an interesting discussion that I want to have, and this is a bit different than what we've done. I'm not looking at hard draft moves or anything like that. I want to talk about where I've seen a divide develop in the Steelers fan base. And we already knew there was some divide over Kenny Pickett when he played for the Steelers, but I have to admit, I don't think I've realized just how big the divide was between Pitt fans who are Steelers fans and non-Pitt fans who are Steelers fans, even over the departure of Kenny Pickett. And I didn't really notice this until, your boy's been busy. I've been covering Pitt for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Y'all saw me when I was in DC covering the ACC tournament. I just covered their pro day. So if you want to read about any Pitt players on their pro day, there's that too. I broke some news last night on, a player that the Pitt was contacting in the portal who could be a really interesting asset from Kentucky. All that. So sometimes when your boy's there and doing this show and doing everything else I do, sometimes I miss things that are happening on social media between fans and whatnot. But what made me realize this was when I was tweeting about some of the players that I was talking to at Pitt's Pro Day, and like some of them, like Matt Gonsalves, MJ Devonshire. I talked to these guys, and they would say like, hey, like I have a visit planned with the Pittsburgh Steelers. I have a top 30 visit planned with the Pittsburgh Steelers. What Gonsalves said. Now, remember, a top 30 visit does not count as a top 30 visit if it's from the local team that's in your city. So neither of those guys will count against the Steelers, but the Steelers can bring them in and talk to them. But I post that on there, and I'm thinking like, oh, that'll be something cool that people probably cling on to. And the overwhelming response of Pitt fans were just like, stay away, guys. Like, we love you. Go somewhere else. And I was like, what? And I was just like, I don't you want to root on these guys a little bit further and have them close home so you can go see them again? And then I was looking, and I was like, people are like, hey, we do not appreciate how Kenny Pickett was treated by the fan base. I know that some people are going to be like, saying like, oh, they're such crybabies, and Pitt fans are going to say, no, we're justified. And I'm sitting here in the middle, and I'm like, look, I got a Pitt degree. I cover Pitt, and I covered Kenny Pickett in college, and I'm just sitting here being like, whoa, like this is kind of wild to see the back and forth that has developed here, and it's still here even as Kenny Pickett's gone. I was talking to Pitt fans this week who were, just being honest, like, Chris, like, I'm a Pittsburgh person, but I don't like this. I'm not feeling the Steelers right now after the way Kenny Pickett was treated. And it's funny, like on the flip side, I talked to people that were happy that Kenny Pickett's gone. They're like, they don't care for it. And I'm just thinking like, man, how did this divide happen? Because I think that you guys saw how I covered Kenny Pickett. When he was messing up, I was saying like, hey, he's messing up right now. Like that Niners game to open the season, I broke down on Twitter. I was like, hey, there's guys open early, often, middle field, sideline, wherever, touchdowns, first downs, he ain't hitting them. And I was acknowledging that. But I was also acknowledging when like, hey, this thing over here could have been better for Kenny Pickett. And it was so interesting to see Pitt fans who traditionally love my coverage be like, why are you hating on Kenny Pickett? I'm like, I'm not hating on him. I'm just saying what he's not doing right. But I'm also then talking to people that like, there were people that were like, yeah, Chris, you go after Kenny Pickett. I'm like, I'm not going after him. I'm just evaluating him. And then people would get mad when Kenny Pickett did something right. And those people that said, oh, you're a Kenny Pickett lover or whatever they call people who liked Kenny Pickett or whatever. And I'm like, no, I'm just evaluating from what he was. And it's just like the animus from either side of that debate got very toxic. It was crazy for me to see. And now I'm realizing, like, okay, this is a much bigger thing that's happening here. Now, I will acknowledge a few things. There is definitely, like, Pittsburgh is, has its college fandom split up. Like, there is Pitt, Pitt is the university in the city. It's, that has a hold, but there's a lot of Penn State fans that are in Pittsburgh, a lot of West Virginia fans. And of course, all three of those schools don't like each other. They all hate each other. They always talk trash to each other. And, I do think that there's some of that has seeped into this, but I also think, I'm like, man, like, it's not that deep about Kenny Pickett. Like, I get why Pitt fans are upset, but I'm like, also, like, let's all acknowledge some truths about this situation that developed here. Kenny Pickett had a raw deal in Pittsburgh. That's just a fact. Whether you liked him or not, the offensive coordinator situation didn't work. His offensive line was not good up until, it started to get good in the second half of the season. And then just when they got rid of Matt Canada and things started to maybe open up a little bit more for the offense, he got hurt, lost his job. By the time he was ready to come back, there was another guy who was playing pretty well. It was putting up points, and the Steelers was just like, hey, we're going to ride with the hot hand, which wasn't an unreasonable move. But as I said before on this show, I think it was last week, I did a show about this, and I was like, hey, it's not fair, but it's business in the NFL. Kenny Pickett wasn't putting up numbers. Even in the one game that he played without Matt Canada, they got over 400 yards of offense, but they still only scored 16, 17 points or whatever. I understood what the Steelers were doing there. And so we can acknowledge he got a raw deal, but we can also acknowledge that, at least there was a yellow flag, and we kind of put up the yellow flag. We didn't call it a red flag. Maybe we should have called it a red flag, but when he was asked the week after the Steelers beat the Bengals with Mason Rudolph at quarterback, and it was my video that went viral a little bit because I took a video of it and and people were like, whoa, when Kenny Pickett was asked, like, did you learn anything from the sidelines watching Mason Rudolph and the success of the offense? And he just flat out answered no, and then gave no further comment. It was obvious he did not like that question and was like, I ain't trying to contribute to that. And no, I didn't learn it. It's just like that obviously was not a good response to that question. Even if the answer was like, hey, listen, like, Mason Rudolph didn't do anything too amazing and he didn't want to down Mason or anything like that. You could at least say, hey, you know what? Say something to just kind of smooth that over. There's several times where athletes, they know that there's questions that they don't want to actually answer. There's times Mike Tomlin does it all the time. That he's a master at that. That's where a lot of his Tomlinisms come from. He doesn't want to give you what he's actually thinking. And that's a moment where you could see Kenny Pickett. I guarantee you there's times that I've asked questions to Kenny Pickett that he doesn't want to actually let me know what he's thinking, but he knew that he had to give an answer because that's part of his job. And in that moment, he didn't want to. And that was at the moment, I was like, oh, that wasn't a good response. He could have been better there. But I think that's acknowledging hey, there was unhappiness there with what's going on and being miffed about how his situation was dealing out. And maybe that was seen in other ways that we weren't privy to because, we're not in the team meetings. We're not seeing, maybe that bled over into other things. And maybe that boiled over even a lot more. And obviously it did when Russell Wilson was brought to town. But I'm thinking acknowledging these truths needs to kind of, I think, quell what's been a bit of a hatred, I think, between multiple sides of the Steelers fan base, because it's definitely a divide right now of people who are just like, Kenny Pickett was wronged or Kenny Pickett deserved what he got. And I'm just like, guys, can we just acknowledge what actually happened here in that, yes, Kenny Pickett, we can say he got a raw deal, but did the Steelers do what they had to do to kind of move on? Yeah, too, because you weren't guaranteed. We even said going into the season when going into this offseason when they went and got Russell Wilson. I said on the show when we still thought Kenny Pickett was going to be with him there, I was like, I'm not 100% sure Kenny Pickett's going to start over Russell Wilson, but I was also saying I could see there being a competition, or at worst, this could be set up a great redemption arc for Kenny Pickett. And I said that multiple times during that week before he was traded away. And I said, if Kenny Pickett sits behind Russell Wilson and Russell Wilson either, he tanks and then goes back in and Kenny Pickett goes back in and gets a chance to shine. And he proves that he was always the quarterback that the Steelers should have invested more in. Or if Russell Wilson has a good year, then goes back somewhere else, and then Kenny Pickett's better in his 4th year and gets and is the starter, like that would have been a great redemption arc. But Kenny Pickett didn't want to go through that. And I think acknowledging that could get people past what is such a topic that seems to have everyone on such different sides of a fence that it's not even worth having a conversation. And I got to say, like, it's talking to a brick wall sometimes, and not just on one side, on both sides. That's the crazy part of this. Like, people who hated Kenny Pickett are like, Pitt fans can just not be satiated by anything you say. They're just unreasonable Kenny Pickett lovers. And Kenny Pickett fans said the same thing about people like, no, you're just Kenny Pickett haters. And I'm just like, guys, I'm sitting in the middle like, can we all take a breather here for a minute? I mean, look, I'm a person who I covered Kenny Pickett in college. It would have been a great career thing for me, because obviously I'm covering Pitt, I'm covering the Steelers, and I'm doing this, and I plan to be doing this for quite some time. It would have been a great thing for me if Kenny Pickett stuck on here forever. If he was the franchise quarterback, the Steelers invested everything in him, and he wins, Super Bowls or whatever. That would have been awesome. I could have written books about that when I'm in my 50s, and Kenny Pickett's retiring and everything. That would have been a great thing for my career. But like, at the same time, I'm not gonna lose sleep over it. I'm gonna be like, all right, well, that happened. We're moving on, and that's what I suggest other people do about this, because I don't think that it's worth all this situation, and including like rooting for Pitt players to not go to the Steelers. And there's some people that also, like, again, on the flip side of the non-Pitt fans who talk about this, there's some people that say no more Pitt players, never get another Pitt player. Are you stupid? You're telling me if Aaron Donald was coming out from the Panthers, you would pass him up because he just went to the university you don't like? Get out of here. But I also said to the people that are saying stay away, Pitt players, like, you know what? Matt Gonsalves, to me, I watched Matt Gonsalves play. If he's healthy, he's dealing with some turf toe and he's still recovering. But if that guy's healthy and they can get him in the 4th round or 3rd round, wherever you think that he's projected to be, that's a versatile player you can have on either side of the offensive line at tackle or guard. And that's a huge weapon for the Steelers that they can bring around. And I think he would be much better than Dan Moore. And he would take time to develop, sure, but like that works out. And that's not the same thing as a Kenny Pickett who's going to be under a microscope in a bad situation and have a lot of things go against them. So I'm just saying what I'd say. I know I'm kind of bouncing between a lot of different things here on this topic, but I think there's a lot of toxicity between fans that hate Pitt and love Pitt, but all follow the Steelers. And if we can just take that out for a minute and honestly just kind of just acknowledge what happened with Kenny Pickett, the truths that were bad for him and that weren't bad for him, that were bad because of him, I think we can all get past this and get back to like looking at things in a more realistic manner. Just me, as a objective observer who covers both Pitt and the Steelers in all my capacities. That rant's over. I just had to get that out. It's a Friday episode. It was something I've been thinking on, and I was like, you know what? We're gonna talk about this a little bit. Let me know what you think about this. Was I unfair to any of these sides and talking about this debate? Let me know what you think. Also, just a little bit of news, housekeeping here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. If you're part of the Locked On Steelers Facebook group, I posted this Thursday night. I'm looking for moderators for that group because it's been crazy and a lot of y'all been asking for it. And I'm like, listen, if y'all saw how much work I do, you would understand why I don't have time to organize that group and get rid of all the spam posts that are on it. And even so, I get rid of a lot of the spam posts in there. I've gotten rid of like almost 800 this month alone. But we're looking for moderators, and I made a post in the Locked On Steelers Facebook group. If you go to the Locked On Steelers Facebook group and you want to be a moderator, post in there. I'm going to go through those profiles. If you've been a member of the group for a time and you're active, or you know someone that is active and wants to help out, I will look at those profiles. And I want to assemble a committee of moderators who can help make that group a healthier, safer group and get rid of all the spams and the scam profiles that have kind of gotten in there. We're not going to make it a private group. I'll tell you that, because if you make it a private group, you can't make it a public group. It's a weird Facebook thing. But point being, we're gonna, I am looking for people to help there. So if you want to help out there, go to the Locked On Steelers Facebook group, look up, it's like one of the first posts that'll be there on the show. But that's been your show here, the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Read my work at the Pittsburgh Post Gazette. Find me on the Locked On Steelers podcast every Monday through Friday on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes. Back Monday with another Mock Draft Monday episode as we get closer to the NFL draft. It'll be April next time we speak. We'll get into more draft talk then. See you here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.